Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're here to talk about the addition of colostrum replacer to improve weaning transition in calves. Welcome, Al. Thank you for joining us here today.
It's good to be back.
Any of
Actually,
those questions, if you just one sec, Al. If anybody has any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat. If you're joining us from social media, post your questions directly in those channels. So, Dr. Kurtz, over to you. Let's talk about this research.
okay, let's do a little background first. There are what I think are three critical periods for calves. The first one is at calving, and that includes the condition of the cow, the environment in which the calf is born, if it's clean, how colostrum is taken and fed to the calf, is it clean? All of those factors, because those factors can contribute to whether the calf gets inoculated with a problem at that particular stage. So the next stage then is the first 2 weeks of life, because it's during that period when most calf death loss occur, as well as most diarrhea problems. And they're typically tied back to this environmental situation and colostrum administration at birth. So those two are closely related. But the one that many don't think about is what I call the weaning transition period, which is the 2 weeks before full weaning and the 2 weeks after full weaning. In some cases, there's attention paid before, but not afterwards. And so one of the possibilities is what we do to facilitate a better weaning transition. So this group at the University of Guelph took a novel approach and said, well, let's look at adding a colostrum replacer to the milk replacer during this period. And what they did, they found a larger herd in Ontario where they went to do the trial, and that was January 6th to April 6th, 2023. And that was a single large commercial herd. All the calves were enrolled. All the calves that were enrolled were Holstein female calves. And then, of course, they had a herd program for the first feeding of colostrum, which he had a minimum of 25% bricks, so it had a high quality. And then they had a second feeding within 24 hours of 4 liters. So they had a good program to get the calves started off. Then the calves were moved into individual pens about 2 meters square and an inside facility. And then they remained there until 70 days of age before they were moving into group pens. Now, the calves were fed a commercial milk replacer, which was 23 protein, about 19 fat, and about 50% lactose. Not unusual. And it was fed at 15% solids. So they're feeding at a high solids level. That's the upper limit I think you should feed a milk replacer. Above that, I think you're in the red zone. And it was fed by a robotic rail feeding system. You may have seen some pictures of those. They go up and down in front of the calves, and then they read the calf's number, and they provide an allotment for the calf to drink in a period of time that's been pre-programmed. So they pre-program it to 3 equal feedings at 5 in the morning, noon, or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and 9 o'clock at night. They were fed 3 times daily at 9 liters total. So that was a starting period for about 7 days. Then they had a step up program, and I won't go through those details. We might get ourselves lost in that. But with this kind of a system, it's easier to program it for a step up and step down program. So they went through that. And if you look at the time and the amounts that they were fed, let's see, they were the average dry matter intake of the milk replacer was about 1.67 pounds. Now that's been found by some studies by Mark Hill and others at Provimi Research Center to be about the upper limit before you start affecting negatively the starter intake and maybe rumen development. In this case, though, the starter was an all pelleted starter, not what I would prefer nor recommend. But they weren't providing any hay with it, so that means that they could be marginally acidotic because there's no hay nor no any particle size like from a texturized starter. And then what they did was they started at day 57 with the the colostrum replacer, which was mixed to have 12.5% solids, and that was like 16.4 grams of IgG, and then 3 liters of milk replacer at 15% solids. They also made sure that the treatments were the same because when you add a colostrum replacer, you're adding nutrients, energy, and protein. So they adjusted the program so that there wouldn't be a difference due to nutrients per se level of the milk replacer and the starter. Then that was fed up to 90 days to 70 days of age when they were fully weaned and moved into a group. So if we look at the first graph, and I should note that Michael Steele at the University of Guelph provided me the data so I could graph the data. The two figures we'll see here. We look at the daily starter intake. So up until 57 days, of course, the two groups were basically the same, which you would expect. But day 57, then you had the colostrum replacer added to one of the two treatments, and that continued all the way out to day 70. Actually, day 57 was when the weaning process began. Day 64, they were fully weaned, and then at 70, they were at the end of the period. So you don't see much difference between 57 and 64 days. There's a little bit of crossover effect, so not really much difference. And then you notice at day 64, after that, there's some separation. And again, though, that there's a crossover effect. So it's not like the colostrum replacer, the orange line, stayed on top or on bottom. It first was a little bit below the other one, and then at day 68 for the last couple of days they went above till they came back together. So one of the issues, of course, is that this is starter intake, and starter intake in young calves is quite variable, and that's why you often need many calves per treatment. In this case, they went to a large herd so they could get many calves, or at least more calves that were similar age without a big age span. Let's see, they ended up with how many calves? All calves were on the treatment. Okay. So that's why they tried to get as many calves as they could. But with variation, even if you had like 30 calves, which is I think about how many they had on this study per treatment, with variation, it's hard to get this separation. So the starter intake would have been good to track it for another 2 weeks, which would be after this full weaning. But in this particular operation, the calves were then moved to groups. So you lose the ability to track the individual calves on what their intake is of the starter and how they do after they're weaned. If we go to the second figure, that one shows the body weight difference between day 57, when they began the weaning process, and day 84, which is actually right before they moved them into groups. And here you see that the body weights were very similar from 57 to 64 days when the weaning process really began. And then there was some separation. And in the body weight, there was a clear separation that the calves fed to colostrum replacer gained additional weight. Looks like maybe about, not quite 10 pounds at the end, but maybe 7 or 8. And they also took some blood values. So they looked at serum IgG and total protein and tried to determine whether there was any difference or not. They didn't see any differences there. The other one they looked at was beta hydroxybutyrate. And beta hydroxybutyrate is an indicator of rumen papillae development or function. And so they were looking at that. But remember, this was an all pelleted starter with no haze. So there wasn't much of a chance that there was going to be that good of rumen development, as you can, uh, and that would be why they didn't see any differences in beta hydroxybutyrate levels at all. So, what are some of the factors in this study that maybe prevented us from finding more differences? There were the milk replacer levels were relatively high, so that minimizes starter intake. And then the starter was all pelleted with no hay, so there was no particle size for rumination and development from the pelleted starter, and with no hay, there was no buffering effect on the acidosis. And then in the studies I mentioned before by Mark Hill and others, they almost always fed well texturized starters. So that's another difference. It's hard to compare calf studies to each other if they're fed on different starters, and that's a whole nother area that I'm going to get into at some point down the road. And of course, there are a number of factors which affect how well calves go through weaning transition. Jim Drakely at the University of Illinois gave a good presentation at the dairy science meetings this last summer about that at an ARPAS symposium. And that article should be published in the ARPAS journal in a shorter period of time. And he covered a number of different areas that affect how well or poorly calves do during weaning transition, such as the more changes you make at one time, the more stressful it is to calves, even if you don't change your feeding program. But usually they're moved, often into a group. The feeding program is changed. Everything has changed for them. So that's a lot of big changes at once. And so you may remember that there's some data I've reviewed in the past, National Animal Health Monitoring System, with a subset of herds in the US. And what I found by looking and extracting data from their study was that before weaning, the calves on these dairy farms averaged about 1.6 pounds, which is good. But after weaning, it dropped to 1.3 pounds. So that says that on dairy farms, there are factors, among which could be, of course, the starter and others, that don't contribute to a good weaning transition program, and the calves actually lose performance after their wean. So that tells us we've got a challenge ahead. So in this case, the colostrum replacer showed some benefit, but there's other factors we might look at that could also be beneficial. And then you have the cost factor, how much it costs to feed a colostrum replacer in addition.
Always got to look at that cost. That's super important when it comes down to it as well, right?
Right. And, in some cases, colostrum replacers have been used well on regular situations on dairy farms because there's what I always call the graveyard shift, which is the night shift.
Mhm.
And sometimes they get overwhelmed because cows have so many calves at night. And if they can't get colostrum handled very well to get to the calves, they might use a colostrum replacer instead because it simplifies it. And I remember
Mhm.
once where there was a large grazing dairy on a pivot point irrigation system in the southeast U.S. where, and there were jerseys, and where the cows calved was totally different from where the calves were raised. And just the problem of getting the calves fed colostrum and moved over was creating a lot of health issues and deaths. And so the manager made a decision to feed all the calves colostrum replacers. And the owner at first thought, what's going on here? And said, that's pretty expensive. And when the manager said, well, if we don't do that, here's what will happen. We lose calves and they don't do very well. So there's some cases where it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. A reminder, if you have any questions for Dr. Kertz, to post those there in the chat or in your social media feed. We do have the article that Dr. Kertz has in this week's, it's on feedstuffs.com. That is posted there. There's a link, and you can read the column in the January digital edition of Feedstuffs that's coming to your mailbox in a couple weeks. So Dr. Kertz, as we always like to ask you as we wrap up, what's the bottom line in all of this?
The bottom line is we have a lot of improvements we can make in the weaning transition program, and that's the 2 weeks before full weaning and 2 weeks after, because the 2 weeks before full weaning determines how well they wean and perform afterwards. And usually the issue there is inadequate starter intake. And in a case like this, maybe it's because it's also all pelleted with no forage fed with it. So they don't get good rumen development by the time they're weaned. And then they're not going to do as well after they're weaned. There are some studies that were done by Mark Hill at the Provenius Center where they looked at that, and they found that the less starter intake they had before weaning because of high milk replacer feeding, the poorer they did afterwards. It affected their intake, their digestibility, and their daily gain. But most dairy farms don't know that because they typically group their calves after they're weaned, and they don't know how well they're doing at all. They don't have a good measurements. In the NOMS data, they had tape weights and some other weights, and I was able to calculate the difference between those two periods. The authors didn't notice that at all in their valuation of it, but the data were there to extract and pull out. So that's probably the biggest Achilles heel on dairy farms is the poor weaning transition program.
Very good. Well, thank you for joining us this month, and we'll get back with you next month with another update. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Likewise, we appreciate all of you joining us. We also want to invite you to join us tomorrow for a live weather outlook, a long-term outlook with Greg Solier. So you want to tune in for that, 1 p.m. Central. For Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.